Okay, the two last modifiers I want to take a look at are cut and coil. So let's start with coil. I'm going to go ahead and add a new modifier. I'm going to choose coil here. So coil is going to be a bit similar to noise in the sense that it's going to take your hairs and it's going to bend them along their length based on essentially a frequency and a magnitude of a wave. So we have our typical mask, which is just turning it on and off, right? So any value between 0 and 1 is going to turn it on and off. Our count is going to be like noise's frequency. However large this number is right here is going to determine how many times it coils. And so the difference between noise and coil is noise is going to be randomly jittering the surface, kind of like wiggling the length of the hair, where coil is going to be spinning the hair around itself in a fairly predictable manner. And there's some other differences that we're going to take a look at in a second, but let's go ahead. I'm going to bring this density down lower so we can take a look at this. Let's just see it with barely any on. Let's see that. And I'm going to also bring the magnitude down on this, or the radius down on this. So I'll just bring that down to like 0.2, and here we go. So that count right here is going to be how many times it's going to coil. So if I set that to like 5, right, you're going to get 5 coils. If I set it to 10, I'm going to get 10 coils. Again, you know, I'm starting to lose some resolution, so I may have to up my resolution here for my modifier CV counts. And then if I have it down to 1, it's going to be very low waves. So if I was making really, really curly hair, obviously this would be one of the attributes I would want to be looking at to try to get that tight coil and that springiness to it. I could, of course, add a randomized count to this. So I can come in here and just like anything else, I can do rand. And let's say we'll do 1 to 5. Click accept. So each hair has a slightly randomized value. So you can see that one right there has not very much coil, whereas that one has a lot of coil. And yeah, and then the radius is going to be the size of these coils. So how far away from the original hair is the coil kind of deforming from. So if I set this to 1, obviously that's huge. If I set this to 0.1, it's not very much. So pretty straightforward. These gradients are pretty much the same as they are for everything else, where they're just affecting for each of these attributes how much it's affecting from root to tip. So if I just set that to 5, right, you can see the base is fairly static, right, but then it starts to coil pretty quickly. If I brought this down, you can see the tight coils. Let's go ahead and cap that off. There we go. So that tight coiling is happening towards the end and a little bit towards the base, which is a little or not what I expected, but I might have to take a look at that. So it can be a little unpredictable, as you can see here. I'll show you in a second, but you can see if this is lower, generally the base, you know, the count's going to be lower, so it's going to have fewer coils. And if it's higher, it's essentially multiplying this count value. So if it's closer to 1, it's going to get 5 coils. If it's closer to 0, it's going to get fewer coils. It gets a little weird though, and I just wanted to point this out because this is something you might encounter on other modifiers too, is as I decrease this, you can see in some cases this gets higher, and when I bring this down, right, that value gets higher too. So it gets a little weird. So it's almost like they're kind of balancing each other out, or they have a relationship between each other, and it's not just multiplying this by this value here in isolation. So just keep that in mind. It can be a little unpredictable, but generally speaking, this is going to be lower this is compared to this means that the base is going to have less coil than the other, or than the tip. And here we go. I just brought the density back up, and so it looks something like that when they're all together. Something that I'd like to point out with coil, and let's go ahead and for this I would probably not have that count quite so high. I might have it pretty low, and so you get this kind of like broad kind of breakup here. Let's turn off that noise for a second, and you'll notice that what's cool about coil compared to noise, not that noise isn't cool, is that it's actually affecting the entire clump. So whatever that smallest clump is, it seems to have an effect on that entire clump at the same time with the coil, right? Whereas noise will be operating on hair by hair, which kind of breaks the clump up a bit. So coil will operate on the entire clump, and then noise is going to break up that clump because each hair is being operated, and then they start to be randomized and pull away from each other. So the last modifier I want to take a look at is the cut modifier. So we're going to come up here and we're going to go to cut, say OK. So the cut modifier is a pretty simple modifier compared to the rest we've looked at so far. it is going to be doing essentially the same thing as what we've been doing in the expression editor for the length of our hairs. So when we took that randomized value and multiplied the length value we set here by rand value, it took each of our hairs and gave them a slightly different variation of this length. So whatever we set to here, it multiplied a randomized value for each hair on that, and so each hair was slightly different in length. And so the cut modifier is doing essentially the same thing. We'll just turn that all off. Right, you can see it's randomly cutting each hair. So it's where the randomizing the length of our primitive over here could give us like longer hairs and shorter hairs. In this case, the cut modifier is only cutting our hairs, so it's shortening them. And instead of multiplying on top of the length of our hair, what we're returning is a value that we're going to cut our hair by. So it's actually cutting it by this length. So you got to keep that in mind, is that if I set this to, let's say, 3 and say apply, it might be kind of hard to see here, but I'm actually getting some hairs that are almost like 0, or even some hairs that are actually 0 because I'm cutting it by too much, right? So in here, unless I was multiplying that length by 0, right, this is just like a multiplier on top of what this length value is. So no matter what this length value is, if I set it from 0.7 to 1.3, I'm not really going to get hairs that are getting close to 0. But with the cut modifier, it's cutting our hair an X amount of length that it's returning here. So if that value it returns is equal to or higher than the length of our hair, that can lead to something like this. So it's not something that's very, if you're going to be cutting it by quite a bit, something that's very, I'm not sure what the word for that is, flexible. So if I went in and I wanted to change the length of my hairs, right? If I made these hairs really long, right? And these are going up to like, let's say like 8, right? If I'm cutting them by 3, I'm not going to get any 0 hairs. So that's totally cool. But if I get any lower than that, then that's a problem. Whereas if I didn't have the cut modifier and I was just using that randomized value on this, this is just multiplying on top of what this length of this hair is. So unless I got super short, I'm not going to get any 0 hairs. So just something to keep in mind, that if you're going to be changing the hair length a lot, then you probably want to be careful of what your cut value is and come back and take a look at it. The advantage that the cut modifier has over randomizing the length of our hairs is that whatever we set in here happens before the modifiers. So if I set the length to my hair, it has this initial starting length, and then the modifiers can actually change the length of my hair, right? So we'll take a look at that later. But with noise, noise can actually like make my hair longer if I like push it really far. Same thing with coil. So if you wanted to cut it and you wanted to like kind of have this randomized cutting value, but then your modifier stack started to like really change the length of your hairs, you add this cut on top to add another layer of randomized cut to it to affect the final hair primitive. So that's just something to keep in mind, and you'll find as you work that there's certain situations where you'd want to use one or the other, or sometimes mix in both.